Have you ever done something you probably shouldn't have? Or maybe you've been asked to do something and you know you shouldn't do it, but you do it anyway. I know that I have. I remember I was 10 years old and I went to stay at a friend's house, and believe it or not, 20 years ago and being 10 years old, Pokemon was very cool. And everyone was collecting Pokemon cards, and whilst I was at my friend's house, we went to the shop to see if they had any, and they didn't. But there was one shop that did. The only problem was, it was somewhere my mum had asked me not to go. So what was I to do? Was I to say no, as my mum said I shouldn't go there, or was I to say yes and hope she would just never find out? You see, we're all faced with temptations just like this, and some of them may sound silly, but others can be bigger and more difficult to admit. And the truth is, we all face temptations of all sorts, and we can give in to them and feel terrible when we do. And I did go to the shop with my friend, and yes, somehow my mum found out, and it just wasn't worth it. And over the next month, we're going to be thinking about temptation, and as we do, a series called Get Out of My Head. And temptation is something we all face, and sometimes it can seem the most important thing in the world, and other times we don't even think twice about it. But to be tempted is to be thinking about something that we just shouldn't do. But what causes us to want to do something that we shouldn't do in the first place? Know that we're not alone when we think about being tempted. If we were to go 2,000 years ago, we even see Jesus experience temptation too. And that might surprise you. Even Jesus was confronted with choice of doing things that weren't right. But even though he was tempted, he never once gave in to those temptations. So maybe Jesus is a good person to look at when we think about temptation. You see, temptation isn't a bad thing. It's our response to temptation that matters. That's not to say Jesus is mad if we get things wrong, but he does want to help us make the better decisions. Now, as we read this story, it was written by one of Jesus' closest friends, Matthew. And as we read it, I think there is something we can learn about how to respond to temptations. After feasting 40 days and 40 nights, he was hungry. The tempter came to him and said, "If you are the Son of God, tell these stones to become bread." And Jesus answered them, "It is written, man shall not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God." Here we see Jesus is hungry. He went 40 days without eating, and he's confronted with the tempter. Now, the tempter is later referred to as the devil, but the word we see here is often debated, but Matthew uses the Greek word here for tempter. And that's important for us, as we all face tempters, just like I did when I was asked to go somewhere I knew that I shouldn't. It's what the tempter says to Jesus that's really interesting. He says, "If you are the Son of God." The reason why this is so interesting is because just before Jesus spent those 40 days in the desert, God spoke to Jesus and he said this, "This is my Son whom I love, and with him I am well pleased." God affirms Jesus' identity as a son. And it was this that the tempter tries to make Jesus question. The tempter does the same today as he tries to make us question our identity. Because if he can get Jesus to question his identity, maybe Jesus might forget how much he matters. And if the tempter can get Jesus to forget how much he matters, then maybe Jesus will do something that he wouldn't normally do. And in reality, this plays out for me and you. And here's the point. Who I think I am changes what I do. And what I think is true about me influences what I do. All of us have a wrestling match going on between who God says we are, and the thoughts that say the exact opposite. And that's why it's so important for us to choose to believe that God knows us better than we know ourselves. It's why we should let what God says about us influence what we do. For many of us, what we think about ourselves spills into our actions. And if we think we are worthless and we don't matter, we don't believe our actions matter, so we make poor decisions. If we know how much God values us and how important we are, we remember that every action matters. So when we think about ourselves, it impacts our actions and either it builds us up and our lives up or tears them down. Of course, controlling those actions and those thoughts is easier said than done. And one thing Paul wrote to the church in Corinth is this: we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. This means that we actually take hold of those tempting, untrue thoughts and remind ourselves of what God says is true instead. And we can do this by thinking about what you think about. Like, pay attention to our thoughts and acknowledge both the good and the bad, the true and the untrue. And then those bad and untrue thoughts, we need to replace them by good and true thoughts. We all have doubts about who we are and how God made us, but for a moment, imagine if those thoughts aren't true. Temptation is a human thing, and we all are tempted to do things when we know better. So this week, I want you to imagine how your life might look different if you let what God says about you influence what you do.